Welcome to Conservation and the Power of Story. My name is Cindy, and I am so excited to be part of the 50th anniversary series with Benedictine University. I have a real passion for sharing the natural world through words, through images, and experiences. And today, I am delighted to share some of these stories with you in the hopes that they will inspire a deeper love and delight for you in the natural world. And then I also want to show how you too can use the power of story in whatever conservation efforts you are involved in. And you can share your stories with people to connect and engage them with the natural world. So I am a master gardener. I love to combine traditional garden plants and native plants, especially plants for pollinators. This is kind of what my yard looked like before we didn't have any rain for a few weeks here in the Chicago suburbs. So I love to see what comes to my very small yard. I don't have a big yard, so you don't have to have a lot of room to really make a difference, I feel, in the natural world. I also have a tiny little pond. I dug this out of my suburban clay. You can see we've got marsh marigolds blooming around it. And I dug this about 20 years ago when I first moved to the Chicago suburbs. I wanted to see what would come. And wow, damselflies, dragonflies, lots of birds, small mammals, even a pair of ducks that always comes and takes a few turns around the pond before they take off. So super fun. I'm also a volunteer on the Schulenburg Prairie at the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois. That's about 20 miles to the west of Chicago. Much of my volunteer work happens here. I've been a prairie steward for about, 9 years now, I think. And I have a team of volunteers that meets on Tuesdays where we plant, we weed, and we collect seeds for future prairie restorations. That's been a real joy and a source of a lot of the stories that I tell about conservation. Out at Nechusa Grasslands, which is in Franklin Grove, Illinois, sort of towards Dixon, if you're familiar with Dixon, almost to the Iowa line. I coordinate the efforts of dragonfly monitors, people who go out and count dragonflies and the number of species every year. And I also do that at the Morton Arboretum. So I have about 20 monitors, and absolutely every year is a joy to see how the insect populations are changing. And sometimes it's not so much of a joy. This has been a tough year, actually, for the dragonflies. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later in the program. Those are some of the experiences from these projects that I love to share with people. I did a master's degree in natural resources and environmental communication, which is all about telling stories about the natural world. And my master's degree work was done at Nechusa Grasslands, where we developed a plan to bring visitors to the tall grass prairie after bison had been introduced. And boy, aren't they a lot of fun. So we brought the bison there in 2014. And now we have a herd of about 125 bison. You'll see them during this presentation as well. I have lots of stories about them. I like to share my stories through any medium that I can reach people with. And I was a reluctant blogger, but about 7 years ago, I realized a lot of people didn't have time to read books anymore, and they were going online. They were reading blogs. So I started a blog, a weekly blog, comes out every Tuesday, called Tuesdays in the Tall Grass. You can see this is one about dragonflies, but I blog about my garden. I blog about the tall grass prairie, and really anything that's going on in the natural world. It's just another way to share and engage people with conservation. And then I do write books. I'm a former independent bookseller, and I love to tell stories. I'm fortunate enough to have some books about those stories. The most recent one is Chasing Dragonflies, a natural, cultural, and personal history. It's part memoir and part field stories, being out chasing the insects, and also a parallel story about my journey with cancer. So what I have found is a lot of times conservation stories connect with people when there are people in them, and when the stories about conservation are relevant to people. What I've discovered since this book came out last year is how many people have been on this cancer journey, and how nature has been such a healing source for them, as it has been for me. I have 2 books on the tallgrass prairie, at the Tallgrass Prairie, an introduction with Northwestern University Press. I'll be reading just a little bit from that today. And Tallgrass Conversations in Search of the Prairie Spirit with the wonderful Thomas Dean. That is a collection of photographs and essays, and a lot of the stories you hear today will be from Tallgrass Conversations. Then early in my writing career, I had 2 books. They're books of spiritual devotions. Waiting for Morning, which is a book about losses and how nature and our gardens help us heal after losses. Boy, the pandemic, I can't tell you how healing my garden has been for me when virtually a lot of other avenues were shut off. And then by Willoway Brook is a book about prayer. And that book takes us out to the tallgrass prairie and explores ideas about meditation and prayer in a nature context. So that's a little bit about the books that I love to write. And I love to write because I agree with Robert McKee that storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. Storytelling. And we're all storytellers, so it's not just me, right? We're all storytellers. We all live in a network of stories every day as things happen to us. And there isn't a stronger connection that we can make between people than when we tell them a story. So I agree with Jimmy Neal Smith on that. Storytelling. It's just such a powerful, powerful thing. As for myself, I imagine if you're listening to this program, you're here because you feel as I do. You love the natural world and you love to hear stories about it. I hope you're here also because you want to protect it. We can advocate for conservation in so many different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit in this program as well. But the way I have found for myself to be the most powerful is to tell stories, whether it's about plants, animals, trees, birds, or people, and the way the land is used. And, sometimes if you try to get people excited about a grasshopper, let's say, they're like, well, I don't really understand, but tell them the story of the grasshopper. Invite them into the world of the grasshopper, help them see how the grasshopper maybe has had a story that has changed over the years, and maybe they're going to find it relevant. So relevance has been a really important thing to me in telling stories. So what might it look like? I just want to tell you a few stories about some different plants, a tree, and also some beautiful things in the wetlands around us. And we'll take you on, we'll say, a virtual hike through Illinois, which is the place that I call home. And we'll see what some of the stories are out there that can be discovered. I like this by John Weaver. He says, nature is an open book for those who care to read. Each grass-covered hillside is a page on which is written the history of the past, the conditions of the present, and predictions for the future. Some see without understanding, but let us look closely. So let us look closely. That's what we're going to do. We're going to keep our hearts and minds open and think about some of the stories that the land has to tell us. In Illinois, a lot of those stories are going to be prairie stories. Why is that? Well, Illinois is the landscape of home, right? It's our prairie state. And yet, in the prairie state, 22 million acres of tallgrass prairie were once here, pre-European settlement. And now we have only about 1/100th of that left. That's about 2,300 acres left of high quality prairie remnant, prairie that has never been developed. And where that prairie went is a story in itself, and we'll save that for another time. It's one I teach a lot in my tall grass prairie classes. But I want to look at a few members of that prairie community in this program and talk about their stories. We'll also look at a woodland story, because the woods have a lot to tell us and teach us. We'll see how quickly diversity can be lost. And I don't want you to think it's a sad story, although some of it is sad, but because we can look at these things that we have lost in nature, sometimes it prompts us to take action, to share these stories. Then the wetlands, oh, the beautiful wetlands. They're so full of interesting plants and complexity, so many insects and unusual things going on. So here in Illinois, we'll explore the story of a wildflower that was once used as a love charm, and a small insect that has a very powerful urge to migrate in August and September. So people might not connect with the word prairie or the word tree or the word wetland. I mean, it's kind of a big, anonymous mass in people's head. But when you show them a particular member of that community, a creature or a plant, it will suddenly personalize it for you. I think it will personalize it for them. So let's begin with the prairies, because I love prairies. One of the prairie plants that I think has a great story, and I show people when we walk out on the prairie, is big bluestem. Now, if you've walked on a prairie in Illinois, you've seen a lot of tall grass at this time of year, and you might be like, grass, what's the big deal, right? That's what I mow in my yard. But tall grass prairie, tall grasses like big bluestem are unique. Only North America has tall grass prairie. And this particular prairie grass has cool seed heads. Can you see it kind of looks like a turkey foot at the top? That's its nickname, turkey foot. And its scientific name, or the specific name, is the Andropogon gerardi. And you might go, whoa, this is the reason I didn't like biology, right? All those big scientific names. But this is a cool name, because andropogon actually means beard, or man's beard. And when you look closely at that seed head, can you see how it's kind of hairy looking? It looks like a beard. So those names, those scientific names, really tell us a lot about the plant themselves, and often about the people. In this case, Gerardi was the person who, or Louis Gerard is the person who first technically described it to Europeans, we will say. He wasn't the first to see it, of course. But this plant is beautiful. Artists love it, poets love it, writers write about it. And the Native Americans who lived in our part of the world, the Potawatomi, the Illini, the Sauk, the Fox, they knew that this plant was also a great source of medicine. So they had many different documented uses for it. One thing they would do is make a decoction. So a decoction would be, you would take the leaves of the plant. Here we go, we'll look at the leaves, and you would boil them. And then you would make a very distilled essence of this plant, and then pour the liquid over the body part that maybe needed, that had a fever. So maybe on your forehead, you would pour it over your forehead. The lower leaves could also be made into a poultice, and you would put it right on your, like a wound that you had, and that was supposed to be very healing. It's also been used in the arts. I love to think of the early European settlers coming in and seeing big bluestem, which they had never seen before, right? Because you don't have it in Europe. And if they needed knitting needles, they said, hey, that grass could make some pretty fine knitting needles. And indeed, you can see here, I have tried it and it actually works. So they make a pretty fair set of needles. I don't know what the gauge would be for it, but really, really the plant had utility as well as beauty. Early settlers from Europe who came in too and began to plow the tall grass prairie found that corn would grow the best where the big bluestem grew, which is big bluestem is a sign of fertile soil, kind of an ironic end, right, for this particular prairie grass. The settlers also found that their livestock, like cows and horses, would love to graze on big bluestem. It was ice cream for livestock. So, you know, again, you may think a grass, what's so exciting about a grass? But if you say ice cream, right, that gets people's attention. I love to think of this as the ice cream of the prairie. And its high biomass makes it a promising fuel in the future for alternative fuel production. And think of how these prairie grasses, not just big bluestem, but many prairie grasses who are being studied for their biomass and possible alternative fuel. Think about what a difference that could make to our world. So it gives you a reason to want to conserve this tall grass. Also on the prairie, as we're hiking around and looking to see what we see, we might run into this plant. And this plant, we're going to go out to Nechusa. Oh, excuse me, not the plant. We're going to go out and see this guy. I started to say this plant. Let's go look at this. This is our bison. And we are going to, I want to read you a little essay. It's called Majesty. Pull that up for you. I'm reading from a book. Get back here. So I'm reading from the book Tallgrass Conversations in Search of the Prairie Spirit. And again, it's a series of essays, mostly from my blog and also from my walks on the prairie. And the chapter I'm going to read to you, or the short story I'm going to read to you, took place at Nechusa grasslands. And it's about bringing back the bison. So sit back with me and enjoy a little bit of bison talk here. I enjoy working puzzles. I like the way the full image emerges as I slot each shape into its correct niche. When I slow down and pay attention to the puzzle pieces, I sometimes mentally work through a problem or a relationship issue. It's a good process. But one of the most frustrating things that happens when you're finishing a 1,000-piece puzzle is the realization you have lost a piece or several pieces. Sure, your image is close, but that one elusive piece nags you. It keeps the full image from being what it should be. I think of this as I hike Nechusa grasslands, a 4,000-acre site managed by the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. Nechusa grasslands is tucked into a patchwork quilt of farms about 90 miles west of downtown Chicago. Over its 20-year-plus history of restoring habitat, Nechusa grasslands have served as hosts to more than 700 native plant species, more than 200 kinds of birds, countless amphibians, insects, reptiles, and mammals. It seems like there are enough pieces there to make a majestic image, doesn't it? And yet, the bison were missing. They were the missing piece of the puzzle, a big missing piece. Bison, that's the scientific name. We know them more commonly as American buffalo. They disappeared from Illinois early in the 1800s, but since 2014, through the efforts of people who aren't afraid to dream big, they are at Nechusa grasslands. When I first began as a steward at Nechusa and heard about the plan to restore bison, I wondered, would the preserve suddenly seem like a zoo or one of those exotic animal farms you kind of drive through in rural areas, and you know the ones, they have zebras and llamas and ostrich? Would it just be a curiosity? When the first bison were trucked in and lumbered out onto the prairie, my fears were calmed. Just as a puzzle has a gaping hole where a missing piece should fit, I realized Nechusa had always had a missing piece until now. Conservationist Aldo Leopold wrote, "To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. We almost lost the bison in North America, and if we had, the tallgrass prairie restoration puzzle would always seem incomplete." The grazing bison silhouetted against the setting sun look majestic today at Echinacea grasslands and other preserves, such as Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie. They are a seamless part of the prairie landscape, like they belong there, which of course they do. So that's a little story about bison. And if you haven't seen the bison at Echinacea grasslands or Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie, you should try to get out there and see them. You will see how they are that missing piece of the puzzle, and so many things that they do too that change the prairie, that allow diversity on the prairie. We could tell stories about that for a very long time, but we're going to keep going because I also want to go on our hike and visit this plant. Here's the plant I was talking about earlier. This is the common milkweed. Now, the milkweed probably has the best publicity agent anywhere right now. And many of you will know why, and we'll talk about that in a second. But for a lot of people, milkweed, that name weed, just makes it seem like something we wouldn't want to have. So let's look at its story a little bit. How you dress says something about you, right? Most of the bugs that eat milkweed tend to be very brightly colored, and that's because this plant is known as a toxic plant. And the monarch caterpillar is brightly colored like that. And a lot of birds will avoid it because of those bright colors. And we know too that we think, oh, that plant is toxic, right? So we wouldn't want to eat it. But thanks to those bright colors, you can see the monarch right in here. And as we're doing this program right now, we're in the first part of September and the monarchs are migrating through. And it's the efforts of people who have planted native milkweeds like that common milkweed that have helped those populations recover, and hopefully they'll have a great year. So the monarch depends on that because it is the food source for its caterpillar. And if you have the milkweed in your yard, you'll know it's usually covered with these caterpillars midway through the summer. This one is on some butterfly milkweed that I have. But back to our common milkweed, what a beautiful flower it has. If you ever stuck your nose into the kind of softball size common milkweed and really inhaled, it's the best fragrance going anywhere. I think it has roses beat all the heck. These used to be boiled by Native Americans down and to make a kind of a sugar. And that sugar would actually be like a sweetener, a natural sweetener for them. So what a great plant that you could use it as an alternative sugar source. A lot of early settlers knew too that if you boiled these pods in enough changes of water, supposedly you could eat them, especially the immature pods, the immature shoots, all different parts of it were edible if prepared correctly. And I have to always say, kids, don't try this at home, right? Unless you know what you're doing. Look at it more as a historical use maybe than as a use today. But foragers also love to use the silk, that's the pappus that the seeds are attached to, because it would boil down into kind of a stringy cheese. So lots of Native Americans knew how to prepare this correctly. And the early settlers were taught by them, you know, how they could use it as a food source if they needed it to. Culturally, this plant has a great story. I have had older people in my classes who remember as children being sent out to collect the pappus, or that really nice silk, and they would stuff bags full of it, and then they would use that commercially to stuff life jackets or to stuff like comforters or quilted vests. So it was a very utilitarian plant as well as a beautiful plant. And who among us too has not taken the pod of the milkweed and sailed it down a stream as like a little canoe? That was one of the things I enjoyed doing so much when I was a kid, watching it go down the stream, or taking one of those pappus seeds and just blowing on it and watching it blow up into the air and making a wish before it fell. So the milkweed, so many great stories, some personal, some historical, and many contemporary stories still going on today. So our last plant on the prairie, as we're hiking through the prairie, is one you may be familiar with since the pandemic, and that is the Echinacea, or the pale purple coneflower. Echinacea is probably our poster child for the prairie plant that people most recognize. You see a lot of garden varieties, and when you go out on a prairie, a lot of people say, oh, I know that one, even if they don't know anything else that's growing out there. My husband calls them the badminton birdies, and you can see they look a little bit like that, don't they? But it's become better known during the pandemic because it is medicinally probably the prairie plant that people are most familiar with. Pale purple coneflower can be found, or purple coneflower is often used, found as echinacea at any supermarket tea section or health food store. It's considered to be very good for building up a weak immune system or warding off the flu. So two things that people have both been very interested in since the pandemic. I know I have been drinking echinacea tea probably since the pandemic began. Some people who are allergic to asters or the aster family have to really be careful with us because it is in the aster family and they can have allergic reactions to it. But fortunately, I'm not in that group. Fascinating that every part of the Echinacea plant, every part of it, the bloom, the stem, the roots, all has a different medicinal property. So it's important, if you do use it, you know what part of the plant your Echinacea contains. Does it have the roots? Does it have the leaves or the flowers? And a lot of boxes of tea will actually tell you that. One of the interesting things I think about this plant too is where it gets its name. I love the scientific names of plants. This one is Akinesha Paletta, and Echinacea means hedgehog. Yes, this is Kim Ingalls White shared her picture of her hedgehog, her pet hedgehog, with me for this photo. Thank you, Kim. But look at that. Can you see how it resembles the hedgehog? I love it that that's its name. Sometimes the Greek is also translated, Echinacea is translated as spiny sea urchin, another great way to think of it. And then Paletta, of course, for pale. When you see the pale purple coneflowers too, you might think of the Native Americans. They knew the prairie as their grocery store, as their apothecary, and as a place where they could get all the supplies that they needed for anything in life. And they knew that for ceremonies, the plant could be used to numb various parts of the body. So we can read through Moorman and Runkle and Rusa, who have studied some of these uses, that the plant's juices could be rubbed on your arms, and then you would do like a daring feat, like bathe your hands and arms in boiling water, or put burning coals in your mouth after you applied the juice. So again, I'd say kids, don't try that at home, but isn't that fascinating that a plant like this that looks like such a fragile flower could have these kinds of ceremonial associations? And if you want to read more about that, Daniel Moorman's book, Native American Ethnobotany, is a great one to kind of study up on that. So a beautiful plant, one that you'll find on the prairies wherever you go in Illinois, and one that has stories. We could spend hours just telling the stories of Echinacea and how people have used it. So Then let's take a quick look over next to the prairies. Let's go to the woodland as we hike and just see what's happening over there. When I wrote the book with Tom called Tallgrass Conversations, one of the driving forces behind the book from both of us was a desire to share stories that would motivate people who maybe didn't care about the natural world a lot, or at least it wasn't in the forefront of their minds, to think more deeply about what was going on there and how it connected to us as people. So one of the stories that I wrote was in an essay called Diversity, a story called Diversity. And the story started to take shape when in the Chicago suburbs, we lost our ash trees. What did we lose them to? We lost them to the emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer took out about 70% of the street trees here in my subdivision. You can see how empty it looks. And you know, it was kind of like that old Joni Mitchell song, you don't know what you got till it's gone, right? And you old rockers will remember that. But we didn't really realize what our street looked like with trees until we lost so many of our trees. So this is a little essay about hiking. Of course, my tree story starts on the prairie, hiking at Fermilab, which is in Batavia, Illinois, has lovely tallgrass prairies and woodlands. And on this particular day, I came across some ash trees. What are we made of? How did the universe begin? At Fermilab, the nation's premier particle physics laboratory, advanced particle accelerators helps its 1,700 scientists and researchers dig down to the smallest building blocks of matter and probe the furthest reaches of the universe. As an outpost of the United States Department of Energy here in Illinois, it is heavily protected by guards during times of national crisis. But today, I am free to hike Fermilab's hundreds of acres of restored prairie and trails. I show the gate guard my license and he waves me through. The past and future collide here, much as the particles in the accelerator ring once collided not far from my trail. Our vision is to solve the mysteries of matter, energy, space, and time for the benefit of all, reads their creed of faith. I admire the work these scientists do. I understand their drive to know. The greater drive I feel, however, is to make my peace with unsolved mysteries, even while reaching for understanding. The trails across the prairie stretch to the horizon line, unbroken except by trees and a large pile of something. I hike that way. Did a tornado come through? What is going on? There is a pile of trees, cut and piled to be burned, chipped for wood paths. Why would anybody cut all these trees down? I look closer and I see, ash trees. The ash trees in the Chicago region have been decimated by a tiny pest, the emerald ash borer. The trees are weakened and then die as the ash borer moves from tree to tree, street to street, woodland to woodland, state to state. Only stumps remain of what once were beautiful, stately trees, valued for their utility, their shade, and their beauty. A way of life is passing. Imagine a world without trees. I never could until this. When my suburban Chicago subdivision's trees were lined with ash trees, it was because historically we planted these trees in the same way as we used to plant elms, one after another, a single species lining a tree. Lining a street. When we commit to the easy way, planting one kind of anything, we gamble. It's simpler, isn't it, to know and promote just a few flowers or trees or grasses for our landscape? We know what they'll look like. We know their requirements and their habits. It's easy. It's more comfortable. But when we do, we lose the benefits of a vibrant, healthy landscape teeming with diversity, trees, plants, their associated animals, birds, and insects. As the emerald ash borers moved from tree to tree, they left those hieroglyphics. Go back and take a look at like that. Peel the bark back and you'll see the marks. These are known as the gallery. And indeed, it is artwork of a certain type. I imagine the message of the ash borer hieroglyphics is this: embrace diversity. Think about how to make life richer, not easier. I hiked the prairie past the corpses of the ash trees. My grandchildren will never know what they lost, but I know there is a hole in the natural world that nothing else will fill. Just as my great-grandparents knew what a world with the American chestnut looked like and mourned its loss, a tree I will never see. By refusing to acknowledge our need for diversity, what else will we lose? So that's a little bit about diversity. And our next hike into diversity is going to take us into the wetlands. I think when I do most of my dragonfly work, I'm usually wearing lots of rubber boots or hip waders and headed out into these wetter spots. And I was just out there this week and just admiring how the fall colors have changed in the wetlands. I love the Illinois wetlands. So many of them have disappeared because of development, and with them, the natural sponges and sinks that keep our world from flooding and keep the world healthy. Where I live, flooding is a regular occurrence because we've paved so many things, we've developed so many things, and so when people see wetlands now, they tend to kind of resist them. When they see a wetland like this, the first thought most people have is mosquitoes, right? So what I always try to do is introduce people to just a few of the wetland community members. And I think once you engage with the story of one, it gives you a better perspective on how important the whole is. And again, as a person that chases dragonflies and coordinates the activities of almost 20 monitors who chase them with me on 2 different sites, I love the season between April and October when we have the opportunity to see almost 100 different species in Illinois. Perhaps the first one people notice is this. This is called the common green darner, or Anax junius. Isn't it beautiful? Yeah. It's usually the first one I see in the spring, even when the snow is flying, and the last one I see as late as November. It's big for dragonflies. It's about 3 inches, which is a big size for a dragonfly. And it almost looks like a helicopter in the sky, don't you think? They don't always look like this. If you go out to a wetlands and you look around in the wetlands and bring up a couple of trays of water, you'll likely fish out something that looks like this. This is a dragonfly nymph. They begin as eggs, which hatch into these little critters. And they crawl around like this for up to 7 or 8 years, depending on the species. And they molt. Just shed that skin and get bigger and bigger until they're ready to emerge. This is a federally endangered Heinz emerald dragonfly nymph, by the way, that's being raised over at the Urban Stream Research Center at Blackwell Forest Preserve, close to where I live. This is about then to make a leap into this. This is a different species, but you can see how it's emerging from that old kind of exuvia into this new creature with wings. So it goes from being a creature of the water to this creature of light and air and flight. And that's a very powerful symbol for a lot of people. As it emerges, those wings unfold. We call this the Teneral Stage. And hemolymph, or insect blood, is pumping into its wings. And if nothing eats it, a bird or a frog or even another dragonfly, if none of those things eat it, then it will begin its life of the air. And that life of the air is only going to last a few weeks. So most of its life is lived underwater in those wetlands we looked at. And I think a brief life like that really deserves our attention, don't you? These green darners, however, are different than some of the other species because they have what I call autumn superpowers. Autumn superpowers. This is one that had just emerged out at Mechusa grasslands this week. These late emerging green darners are migratory. Just like monarch butterflies, they're going to take off for the south, often in large groups of hundreds and hundreds, and they're going to fly, we know, at least as far as the Gulf Coast, possibly even further. They're not the only ones, the species that will migrate. We know there's some other species that migrate as well, green darners being the most recognizable maybe, but also the black saddlebags, a very common species here, both at Mechusa and the Arboretum and the Chicago and Illinois region. The black saddlebags will go with them. The wandering glider, our best known migrator, known to travel in parts of the world up to 8,000 miles. So just like us, maybe as the temperatures get cooler, you feel that need to pack your bags and head south. And there's a whole chapter in the book, Chasing Dragonflies, on migration. So if you're interested in that, you can really dive into it. It's still something that's being monitored, and we're still tracking dragonflies and studying them and trying to understand more about them. Most dragonfly species do not migrate. So why do these migrate? Well, it's still kind of a mystery. So in Chasing Dragonflies, I have a chapter that's kind of about the attraction of dragonflies, about the migration story. And I wanted to read you just a little bit about that. For many people I meet when I give talks on dragonflies, the dragonfly, and they almost always have a story about the dragonfly. So I get to hear stories as well as tell stories. So here's a story for you. And while I read it, I'm going to show you some pictures of beautiful dragonflies that I chase and that my monitors chase in the Illinois region. It's the library's annual book fair today. I browse the tables, seeing what's on offer. A face painter waits for customers in the children's area, but at the moment, there are no takers. So on impulse, I take a seat. She smiles and shows me her signature offering: unicorns, flowers, superheroes, rainbows. Of course, I ask for a dragonfly. Maybe you could put it on my hand, I say. I leave with my stack of books and my dragonfly tattoo. My dragonfly tattoo only lasted until I washed my hands. But after I give talks on dragonflies and damselflies, I often hear from people that have the real thing, and they're happy to show me the real tattoos that they have. One time, after I gave a talk on dragonflies and damselflies, a woman patiently stood in line to talk to me. I want to tell you my story, she said. I hear this a lot, and I love it. My best friend died a few years ago, she continued. On the day she died, a dragonfly showed up and hovered nearby. Each year on the day of her death, I see a dragonfly. She showed me her dragonfly tattoo. I'm not a woo-woo kind of person, but I confess her story and the seriousness in which she told it to me made the hair stand up on my arms. After all, some cultures believe dragonflies are messengers from another world. Who knows? As I walked into a park district headquarters to speak for a garden club, a man working the desk began teasing me about the big green net I was carrying. Are you giving a talk on butterflies? He said. I told him I was doing a program on dragonflies. Immediately, he walked out from behind the desk. I have to tell you my story, he said. He recounted how on the day his teenage son left for college, a cloud of dragonflies appeared in his yard. Is this a good thing? He asked me. So I told him a little bit about the mysteries of migration, dragonflies swarming in late August in the Chicago region, usually ready to head for the south. But it's a good omen, isn't it? He asked me. Yes, I think it is, I told him. The parallels of a son headed out on his own for the first time and the dragonflies readying themselves to go south for migration were easy to see. He seemed satisfied and perhaps a little comforted by this information. A father torn between pride and fear, watching his teenage son leave home for the first time to try his wings in the outside world. A woman grieving the loss of her friend, looking for a sign that her friend's spirit was not eternally extinguished. The dragonflies were there with them both of those days. They were witnesses. The dragonflies were a part of their story. I love to hear those stories about dragonflies. And I love to see people who say, Cindy, I didn't want to come and hear about a bug. They call them bugs, but wow, I didn't realize dragonflies, were like this. So many stories we can share with people to get them excited. Plants sometimes can be a little bit harder, right? Plants can be a little harder because, people are familiar with plants. They don't always pay attention with them. One of the plants I found that really connects people to wetlands is this one. This is going to be a beautiful, kind of startling plant. This is called the Cardinal Flower. And I'm going to read you a little bit from Tallgrass Conversations. This is from a chapter called Joy. Boy, we all need a little joy right now. I think we can all use a little shot of joy. So people find relevance, I think, when they can connect a plant with something that's important to them. And I know sometimes the color red just feels really joyful for me. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit from this. Cardinal rules on the prairie in early August. That is Cardinal Flower. Suddenly, she mysteriously appears in the wetlands. She pops up beside the ponds. She strikes scarlet poses throughout the wetlands and the wet prairie. Her raceme of racy red is unmistakable. Swallowtail butterflies flock to her. The hummingbirds approve. In my backyard prairie patch and pond, they hover, drawn to that screaming scarlet. Come closer, the red flowers seem to say. Wait until you see how sweet we taste. Read the field guide descriptions. Showy, there's talk about her corollas. Oh, and those lips, they're juicy, moist loving. Look again. You can't not think of a tube of bright red lipstick. Maybe a midlife crisis sports car. This is a sensual flower. Make no mistake about it. Read on. The plant is temperamental. Her ecological value to wildlife is characterized as low, but really, who would expect something so beautiful to be useful as well as pretty? Although Native American tribes used the cardinal flower in the making of love charms. The ground up roots were slipped into food to end arguments and also as an anti-divorce remedy. Fitting, perhaps, for a bloom so striking to have these supposed powers. That's a little bit from Seeing Red, but I love the cardinal flower. It's just one of my favorites. So you've heard some of my stories now. How will you find your stories to tell? Where will you start? What if you don't know where to start? I love helping people tell stories. That's one of the things I do in my interpretation classes. One thing I encourage people to do in the book, The Tallgrass Prairie, an Introduction, this is from a chapter on connecting. And it doesn't have to be the tallgrass prairie. It can be a wetland or a forest or wherever you find yourself, your backyard garden. But here's just a couple of ideas for you to think about as you're saying, Cindy, I want to find some stories, but I don't know where to start. Make a list of everything you see in a square yard of your garden or the tallgrass prairie or woodland, even if you don't know its name. Sketch what you find, describe it, take a photo of it, then go find out what it is. The iNaturalist app, which is free for your phone, is great for that. Think about what makes some of an area look different than another. Is it wetter? Is it drier? Why are other places less diverse? What is it about this place that attracted you? Then look with a field guide. Take a field guide out to the prairie. Learn the name of one new wildflower and one new grass. Learn the name of one new tree if you're in a woodland. Write the names and descriptions in your journal. Draw them. I think drawing is important, whether we're artists or not, right? When you draw something, you see it more completely than you do with a camera. And so try sketching it. Then take your phone out. I know everybody loves their phones, right? Take your phone out and record some bird song, and then go see if you can figure out what it is. Cornell University has a great website all about birds that you can go do some exploring on and learn some of the fall migrants that are coming through right now. Each season offers new opportunities for exploration. Make a point to be there in the spring. Make a point to be there in the winter. Make a point to be there in the fall, in the early mornings, in the bright sunlight, in the rain and the snow. Each season will show you something different. Each season will give you a new perspective on what you're seeing. So I love this photo too. This is a Baltimore checker spot. This was one that I saw for the first time in the wetlands. And I love to share that story of how I found it with people. And I know you're going to see things like this too. And you can share them with the people that you meet. You can tell them why these things like the regal fritillary are so special. And another way to find these stories for yourself is to volunteer. This is one of my Tuesdays in the Tallgrass volunteers who's out weeding and keeping the prairie healthy, but there are opportunities all around us. Volunteering is how I developed a relationship with the tallgrass prairie, and with that came a deeper relationship with the natural world as a whole. I highly recommend it. Then use your talents. Maybe you have a talent for painting or photography. Use that on behalf of conservation in the natural world. Maybe you write music. Use that on behalf of the natural world. This is a quilt my friend Vicky made for me. Isn't it beautiful? It was from a photo of the tallgrass prairie. And if you look at it, can you see all the colors of the tallgrass prairie in there? Absolutely beautiful. In the book, Tallgrass Conversations in Search of the Prairie Spirit, I write a little bit about a different quilt. I have two quilts that my friend Lynn made me, and how that reminded me of the conservation efforts of people all over Illinois and their love and passion for the prairie. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit from that. This is a chapter or a story called Persistence. Here we go. It's a ritual of autumn, the changing of our summer comforter to a heavy quilt made for us by a friend. And this is that heavy quilt you see. In the winter, when sleet taps against the window, I slip into bed and pull the quilt close under my chin. I admire the patchwork: rust, emerald, peach, grass green, olive, pearl, and oyster. As he quilted, our friend incorporated the transient autumn colors of prairie grasses into the coverlet. I felt nestled into the prairie itself. Deep under, I might go dormant. I could sleep for months, awake to a cleansing fire in February, leaf out and be fresher, vibrant, renewed. It's a heavy quilt. It's made from denims and corduroy, a quilt that, like the Midwestern prairies, looks resilient, ready to handle anything the future might throw at it. It is a quilt for the ages. As I slipped off to sleep one night, I thought of the thousands of tiny stitches in the quilt and the prairie it reflects, the time and care that one person put into one quilt, and the time and care, all the stitches that have been put into the protection and repair of the grasslands that have been lost to us in the Midwest. How will the grasslands quilt be patched back together? We need the conservationist in the field who is bringing back the bison and studying. We need the research student who is trying to understand why a wetland works the way it does. Stitch, stitch, stitch. The The visitor who stumbles across a prairie and sees something of value. She doesn't know what it is, but she wants to learn more about it. So she takes a class, she reads a book, she goes for a guided walk so she will understand more. She takes a stitch. We need the steward who cares for the remnant prairie where the bison are browsing, who reconstructs new prairies by planting them. He knows those new plantings won't replicate the old, but he hopes it will make a difference. He takes a stitch. We need the poet who sees little Bluestem red and wet under the skies, rippling in the wind, and wrestles with just the right word to share what she sees on paper. Stitch, stitch. Or the textile artist, the photographer, the painter, all who are creating images of prairie in ways that open doors to understanding to those who may not have experienced it before. Stitch, stitch. We need the gardeners who make their backyards beautiful, who make prairie patches swirl and glimmer with color and light and insects in motion. A neighbor next door may pause, ask them a question. A spark is kindled in the neighborhood, then the community. Stitch, stitch, stitch. Each person who places each stitch on the tallgrass prairie, each stitch for conservation, one carefully thought out restoration, one painfully detailed research study, one cold morning on hands and knees in the rain and snow, each photograph, each wall hanging, each poem, each song created, each is a stitch in the prairie quilt. Each brings us closer to the beautiful whole of the Midwestern tallgrass that once was complete and now is lost. Keep hoping, keep stitching, persist, sweet dreams. Those stories are a part of it. Those stories are things you can do. Read about these stories. Read stories by John McPhee and Elizabeth Bailey and Sigurd Olson. Read how other people have seen the tallgrass prairie through their own lens of experience. And then think about your experiences and the stories you can tell. Take a class, learn more about a place that intrigues you. Maybe it's a forest, maybe it's a savanna, maybe it's a wetland. Make that place your own. Set out to discover more about it this year. And you can explore those classes through my website, cindycrosby.com. Share those stories with other people. Don't keep them to yourself. Be the spark that ignites a passion in your community for conservation through stories. Take children out. Share nature with the children in your life. We must do this because if they don't grow up caring and loving the natural world, then it will be lost. We are passing it into their care. How you model your love for insects and plants and wetlands and savannas and woodlands and prairies is what they will pick up on. What you show them as important is what they will think is important. Their stories that they hear from you will influence them and influence the world for future generations to come. The writer Annie Dillard said in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, grace and wonder and beauty are all around us, but the least we can do is to show up, to try to be there. Will you be there? Will you be there? Go for a walk. When you close this program, I hope you'll close down your phone, close down your computer, go for a walk, choose one bird, insect, wildflower, tree, or grass species to learn more about. Go home, read about it, learn its story, experience it with your 5 senses, and then share that story with someone you love. Share it with someone who you meet, and help them understand the stories of these places. If we all read the stories of our natural areas, we can keep them at the forefront of the hearts and minds of our community. We can help ensure the protection and conservation of our natural areas for generations to come. Every member of the natural world has a story. Whose stories will you tell? The poet Mary Oliver wrote, "To pay attention, this is our endless and proper work." I want to thank you for paying attention to this program, and thank you for joining us.